Right now, houses feel like such an obvious, fundamental part of human life that it's easy to overlook just how long a journey it actually took early humans to transition from simple, natural shelter toward anything resembling a deliberately constructed house. That transition actually stretches back considerably further into human history than most people probably assume, involving a truly gradual progression worth exploring properly. Let's dig into this properly, because the answer involves distinguishing between several seriously different developmental stages, each representing meaningful progress toward what we'd eventually recognize as deliberately constructed housing. Let's start with natural shelter use, because this represents the necessary starting point for this entire developmental story. Early humans and even earlier hominin species almost certainly relied on naturally occurring shelter, including caves and other natural rock formations, long before developing any capability for deliberately constructing their own shelter. This natural shelter use likely predates deliberate construction by an enormous margin, representing the most basic, foundational starting point from which humanity's eventual house-building capability would gradually develop across an extended evolutionary and cultural time frame. Let's talk about the earliest confirmed evidence for deliberately constructed shelter, because this represents an important, carefully researched milestone worth exploring specifically. Archaeological evidence confirms early humans and related hominin species were constructing simple, deliberate shelters considerably earlier than many people probably assume, with some of the earliest confirmed evidence dating back several 100,000 years, involving simple structures likely made from branches, animal hide, and other readily available natural materials, providing basic protection from weather and potentially predators beyond what naturally occurring shelter alone could reliably offer. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because it pushes the confirmed history of deliberate shelter construction back considerably earlier than the emergence of anatomically modern humans specifically, meaning this particular capability likely developed within earlier related hominin species, representing an important early milestone within our broader evolutionary lineage's gradual development toward increasingly sophisticated shelter construction capability. Let's talk about how these earliest shelters likely differed from anything resembling a really permanent house too, because this represents an important distinction worth exploring in additional depth. These early deliberate shelters were almost certainly simple, temporary structures, reflecting early humans' generally mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle, which typically involved moving between different locations following seasonal resource availability rather than remaining permanently settled within a single fixed location. This detail matters considerably for understanding why these earliest shelters differed so fundamentally from what we'd eventually recognize as genuine houses, since a mobile lifestyle simply didn't require, or particularly benefit from, the kind of substantial permanent construction investment that a settled, non-mobile lifestyle would eventually make practically worthwhile. Let's talk about specific, well-documented examples of early deliberate shelter construction too, because this represents an important, more concretely detailed dimension worth exploring specifically. Archaeological sites have revealed evidence of deliberately constructed shelters using mammoth bones as structural framework in certain regions, alongside simpler branch and hide structures in other locations, demonstrating that early humans developed practical shelter construction techniques specifically adapted to whatever materials happened to be most readily locally available within their particular environment and region, echoing a familiar pattern already explored extensively throughout other discussions regarding early human technology, adapting closely to local environmental circumstances and available resources. Let's talk about the Terra Amata site in France specifically too, because this represents a particularly well-documented, historically significant early shelter site worth exploring in additional depth. This site, dating back several hundred thousand years, reveals evidence of deliberately constructed oval-shaped shelters, including post holes indicating where supporting branches were originally positioned, alongside evidence of internal hearths specifically positioned for warmth and cooking, demonstrating that these early shelters weren't simply basic windbreaks, but represented reasonably sophisticated, deliberately organized living spaces incorporating specific functional zones for different daily activities, even at this remarkably early developmental stage. Let's talk about how basic shelter shapes and structural approaches gradually evolved across this extended developmental period too, because this represents an interesting, technically detailed dimension worth exploring specifically. Early shelter construction generally favored simple, rounded or oval shapes, likely reflecting both structural efficiency, since curved structures generally distribute weight and wind resistance more evenly compared to angular designs, and relative construction simplicity using readily available branch and pole materials. As construction techniques and available materials gradually became more sophisticated, particularly following the transition toward permanent settlement and mud brick construction already discussed extensively throughout this topic, rectangular and more geometrically complex structural designs became increasingly common, allowing for more efficient use of available interior space and easier connection between adjacent structures within larger, more complex settlements. Let's talk about early heating and insulation techniques. Ancient shelter builders developed two because this represents an important, practically significant dimension worth exploring in additional depth. Beyond simply providing basic weather protection, early shelter builders developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for actually maintaining comfortable internal temperature, including strategic hearth placement already touched on regarding the terra amata site specifically, alongside various insulating materials, including animal hide, packed earth, and other locally available materials specifically incorporated into shelter walls and roofing to help retain warmth during cold weather conditions. This detail connects directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding how early humans successfully managed extreme temperature conditions more generally, illustrating how shelter construction represented one important, closely related component of this broader pattern of environmental adaptation and practical technical problem solving. Let's talk about seasonal and semi-permanent settlement patterns that developed before fully permanent housing too, because this represents an important, often overlooked intermediate developmental stage worth exploring specifically before continuing this broader discussion. Some early human groups developed semi-permanent settlement patterns, returning repeatedly to the same specific favorable locations during particular seasons while remaining more mobile during other periods of the year, representing an intermediate developmental stage between fully mobile hunter-gatherer shelter use and the eventually fully permanent settlement already discussed extensively throughout this topic. This detail is worth including because it demonstrates that the broader transition toward permanent housing likely wasn't a single, sudden shift, but rather likely involved this kind of gradual, intermediate developmental stage for at least some early human populations, before eventually transitioning toward the fully permanent, year-round settlement patterns that agriculture's development would eventually make increasingly common and practically favorable. Let's talk about how early house construction connected to available tool technology too, because this represents an important, closely related technical consideration worth exploring specifically. Successfully constructing increasingly sophisticated shelter and housing required correspondingly capable tool technology, including tools for cutting and shaping wood, processing hide and other building materials, and eventually working with mud brick and other more advanced construction materials, connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding early human tool development and its gradual technical refinement across this same extended evolutionary and cultural timeframe. Let's talk about how climate and regional environmental variation specifically shaped different early housing traditions too, because this represents an important geographic dimension worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. Beyond simply available local building materials already discussed extensively throughout this topic, early housing designs also needed to specifically address regional climate challenges, with cold climate regions developing housing designs specifically emphasizing insulation and heat retention, while hot climate regions developed housing designs specifically emphasizing ventilation and heat dissipation, connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding how early humans successfully managed extreme heat and cold conditions more generally through a combination of biological adaptation and practical technological and architectural solutions. Let's talk about the crucial transition toward more permanent housing specifically, because this represents perhaps the single most historically significant development worth exploring in considerable additional depth, connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding early human agricultural development. The transition toward truly permanent, substantial housing developed alongside, and closely connected to, the emergence of settled agricultural life roughly 12,000 years ago, since successfully cultivating crops specifically required remaining in one particular location for extended periods, creating strong practical incentive toward constructing considerably more substantial, permanent housing compared to the simpler, more temporary shelters that had adequately served earlier, more mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyles. This detail is worth appreciating because it directly connects house construction's historical development to this broader agricultural transition already explored extensively in other discussions, illustrating how these two significant historical developments, agriculture and permanent housing, developed closely together, each reinforcing and supporting the other within this same broader historical transition towards settled human civilization. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about longhouse structures specifically too, because this represents an interesting, distinct architectural tradition worth exploring in additional depth, developing independently across several different ancient cultures. Various ancient cultures, including certain Neolithic European populations and later various indigenous North American communities, developed extended longhouse designs. Capable of housing multiple related families within a single, elongated structure, representing an interesting architectural solution specifically balancing individual family space against shared communal living and resource management, reflecting particular social organization patterns distinct from the more individually separated household structures that would eventually become more common within other specific cultural traditions and historical periods. Let's talk about roof design innovation and its practical significance too, because this represents an important, often underappreciated architectural dimension worth exploring specifically. Early builders developed increasingly sophisticated roofing techniques specifically designed to effectively manage rainfall and snow load depending on their particular regional climate, including various thatching techniques using locally available plant material and eventually more substantial techniques incorporating clay tile or other more durable roofing materials as construction technology continued developing and advancing across successive historical periods. Successful roof design represented a truly significant practical engineering challenge, since inadequate roofing could quickly render an otherwise well-constructed house essentially uninhabitable during adverse weather conditions, meaning roofing technique refinement represented an essential, continuously developing component of the broader housing construction tradition already explored extensively throughout this discussion. Let's talk about how early house interiors were actually organized and used too, because this represents an interesting, practically detailed dimension worth exploring before continuing this broader discussion. Archaeological evidence from various ancient permanent settlements, including detailed evidence from Çatalhöyük already discussed extensively throughout this topic, reveals how early inhabitants organized their interior living space, including specific areas designated for cooking, sleeping, and storage, alongside evidence of interior decoration and, in some documented cases, specific ritual or religious features incorporated directly into individual household spaces, demonstrating that these early permanent houses functioned as seriously complete living environments, addressing the full range of daily practical and social needs rather than representing purely basic shelter alone. Let's talk about specific archaeological techniques researchers used to reconstruct how ancient houses actually appeared and functioned too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth exploring in additional depth. Beyond simply identifying structural remains already discussed extensively throughout this topic, researchers rely on careful analysis of artifact distribution patterns within a given excavated structure, examining exactly where specific tools, food remains, and other everyday objects were actually discovered within the structure's interior space, allowing researchers to reconstruct detailed pictures of how ancient inhabitants actually organized and used their available domestic living space on a really practical, everyday basis. Let's talk about how house construction connects to broader questions regarding wealth and social status in early settled societies too, because this represents an interesting, closely related social dimension worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. As permanent settlements developed and grew increasingly complex, house size and construction quality increasingly began reflecting differences in individual household wealth and social status, with archaeological evidence from various ancient settlements revealing meaningful variation in house size and construction sophistication within a single settlement, suggesting the emergence of permanent housing contributed directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding how increasingly complex, settled human societies developed increasing social and economic stratification compared to earlier, more mobile and generally more egalitarian hunter-gatherer social structures. Let's talk about how this broader housing history connects to contemporary archaeological research priorities too, because this represents a fitting way to draw this discussion toward its conclusion. Contemporary archaeologists continue actively excavating and studying additional early settlement sites worldwide, occasionally identifying previously unknown examples of early deliberate shelter or permanent housing construction, meaning our current understanding of this extended developmental history, while already substantially detailed based on the extensive evidence already discussed throughout this entire discussion, likely still represents an incomplete picture, with continued archaeological research likely to reveal additional important detail and nuance regarding this fundamental, universally significant chapter of human technological and social history. Let's talk about some of the earliest confirmed permanent settlements and their specific housing structures too, because this represents an important, historically documented example worth exploring in additional depth. Sites including Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey, dating back roughly 9,000 years, reveal sophisticated permanent housing constructed from mud brick, with individual houses connected directly to each other and accessed through rooftop entrances rather than ground-level doors, representing a seriously sophisticated early example of deliberately planned, permanent residential architecture. Let's talk about how house construction materials and techniques varied considerably across different early human regions and cultures too, because this represents an important, closely related dimension worth exploring specifically. Different early human cultures developed house construction techniques specifically adapted to their local available materials and environmental conditions, including mud brick construction in regions with suitable clay deposits, timber construction in heavily forested regions, and various other locally adapted construction techniques, reflecting the same broader pattern already explored extensively throughout other topics regarding early human technology, developing in direct response to specific local environmental circumstances and available resources. Let's talk about how researchers actually study and confirm this gradual housing development history too, because this represents an important methodological consideration worth addressing directly. Researchers rely on careful archaeological excavation of ancient settlement sites, examining preserved structural remains, post holes indicating where wooden support structures once stood, and various other physical evidence, allowing researchers to reconstruct increasingly detailed pictures of exactly how early human shelter and housing construction gradually developed and became increasingly sophisticated across this extended historical timeframe. Let's talk about how house construction connects to broader questions regarding early human social organization too, because this represents an important, closely related consideration worth exploring before wrapping up this broader discussion. The transition toward permanent housing likely connected directly to broader changes in human social organization, including evolving concepts of family units, private property, and community structure, since permanent houses created a fundamentally different kind of physical and social space compared to the more communal, temporary shelter arrangements typical of earlier mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyles, connecting directly to broader questions already explored extensively in other discussions regarding how settled agricultural life reshaped human social and economic organization more generally. Let's talk briefly about evidence for early construction cooperation and possibly even organized building practice too, because this represents a fitting, final detail worth including before this discussion concludes. Some archaeological sites reveal evidence suggesting coordinated community-level construction efforts with certain larger or more architecturally complex structures, likely requiring cooperative labor extending beyond what a single family or household could realistically accomplish alone, suggesting early permanent settlements likely developed at least some degree of organized community cooperation and shared labor specifically around significant construction projects, representing another interesting dimension of the broader social organization already discussed extensively throughout this topic that developed alongside and directly supported this settled permanent housing tradition. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full story of when humans first built houses turns out to reveal a really gradual developmental progression extending across hundreds of thousands of years, rather than any single, isolated moment of invention. Simple, deliberate shelter construction likely developed several 100,000 years ago, considerably predating anatomically modern humans specifically, while truly permanent, substantial housing developed considerably more recently, closely connected to agriculture's emergence roughly 12,000 years ago, with increasingly sophisticated permanent settlements like Saralhoyuk demonstrating just how quickly this permanent housing tradition developed into seriously sophisticated architectural achievement. Once settled, agricultural life created the practical circumstances actually favoring this kind of substantial construction investment. So the next time you casually walk through your own home without giving it a second thought, it's worth appreciating that you're benefiting from an extraordinarily long developmental history, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years to the earliest deliberate shelters and considerably transformed by agriculture's emergence roughly 12,000 years ago into the kind of permanent, substantial housing tradition that eventually produced the modern homes most people today take completely for granted. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as fundamental and universal as housing actually required this much gradual developmental progression closely connected to broader changes in human lifestyle and social organization, what does that suggest about how deeply our current, seemingly obvious assumptions regarding permanent housing and settled living actually reflect a considerably more specific, historically contingent development, rather than representing some kind of simple, inevitable feature of human existence that could only ever have unfolded in exactly this particular way?